Alright, so welcome back, grade 9s. We are continuing our look at the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Now we are on page 2, moving backwards a little bit through this lesson, and we're going to look at some historical context of the Charter, and then we're going to look at some specific cases so that we can apply the Charter and see what causes some events and what charter rights that would be violated if the event had occurred today. So we're going to look at some events in Canadian history and somewhat speculate how they would be different now that we have the Charter. How because of the Charter, this couldn't happen or shouldn't happen. So to begin with, historical context is about events and the generally accepted values and attitudes that shape the actions of people in the past. It's useful to think about historical context because it makes you aware that the present is also shaped by events, values, and attitudes. The point of comparing the past and the present is not to judge the past, but to better understand the present. The past connects to the present, and historical context is part of understanding how. So, the first one we want to look at is First Nations and the Indian Act. In 1876, Parliament passed the Indian Act. The Indian Act affected First Nations, who had negotiated and signed treaties with Canada's government. It was passed without consulting First Nations, at a time when people of European descent generally viewed European ways as superior to the ways of other cultures. At points in its history, the Indian Act would require First Nations people to obtain government permission to wear traditional clothing. So you want to wear traditional clothing, you need the permission of government. It banned traditional ceremonies such as the sun dance. It prevented First Nations from taking political action. Even if First Nations people own things like cattle, they would have to ask the federal government permission to sell the cattle. So, First Nations and the Indian Act, looking back now at the Indian Act before the 1982 Charter of Rights and Freedoms, explain to me how this violates or would violate the Charter today. So, I want you to think about it. I want you to write something down. Take a moment. Be engaged here. Don't wait for me to give you the answer. So write down something. Think about, okay, the sections of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. What are we talking about that would protect Indigenous peoples, Canada's Aboriginal peoples, Canada's First Nations from this kind of relationship with the federal government? And then let's see if we can come up with it. So there's going to be a pause on the video, a little dead space. So to help you out a little bit, here's some sections of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We have the Guarantee of Rights and Freedoms, and then we have the list of fundamental freedoms. We have democratic rights, mobility rights, legal and equality rights, official language rights, minority language education rights, enforcement, general application of the Charter, citation, and constitutional act. Please keep in mind that I showed you tomorrow's evaluation, and you'll need to be able to distinguish between rights like democratic and mobility, legal and equality, with things like fundamental freedoms. Having said that, which section up here do you see a connection with this case study, with the Indian Act, with the federal government saying to Canada's First Nations, you need our permission to wear your traditional clothing. You need our permission to sell your cattle. You need our permission to travel throughout Canada. So which rights are being violated? It's okay to be wrong. Just shout out some of the rights. Yes?
Equality rights?
Equality rights. We're not treating people equally. We're prejudging. We're discriminating. We're treating one group separate from another based upon, in this case, their culture. We're saying, your culture is less than our culture, so we get to govern your culture. That's ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism, my ethnicity, my culture is superior to yours. It's ethnocentrism. It's racism. It's the reason why there's a lack of social justice in Canada as well as America. We're looking at America ablaze in 2020 with riots and protests about social justice. Canada often hides a lot of our inequality, our lack of justice. Even though Trudeau meant to create a just society, we don't have one yet. But in the Charter, there is a section about equality rights that because of that, the federal government shouldn't be able to do this today. Anything else? Any other parts of the Charter that you remember saying, maybe it applies to that? Yes?
Part of the fundamental freedoms.
Part of the fundamental freedoms. So when we click on the fundamental freedoms section, section 2 says things like freedom of expression, freedom of belief. So to some extent you might be seeing your clothing as part of your expression, right? Your belief. Freedom of assembly. So if the federal government says you're not allowed to have a Sundance, you're not allowed to have a powwow, well, that's us having an assembly. We're assembling together to celebrate. Now, we have that fundamental freedom to assemble. You cannot govern us. You cannot parent us. We don't need your paternalism here. You're overstepping. You're overstepping your relationship. Any other things that are being restricted? If the federal government says, we are going to monitor you, and we will decide to what extent you're allowed to come and go from the reserve. So if you're going to leave the reserve, we need to know. Yes?
Mobility.
That's a mobility rights issue. Why would some Canadians be watched and be policed in a way that not all Canadians are? Why are some Canadians having their rights restricted? Now, please keep in mind, one of the main themes we've been having this week is the idea of reasonable limits. So looking back, was it reasonable to say, you know what, you can't have a Sundance? Well, were Sundances resulting in the deaths of individuals? Were people dying at them? Were people being hurt at the Sundances? Why would we say no to a Sundance, to a celebration? Is it reasonable to say no to a powwow? Why would we be saying no? So, in hindsight, we might look back and say, yeah, that's not reasonable. That's not reasonable. There'd have to be some kind of atrocity happening, right? That we have to protect people from. Any other sections of the Charter that you might think apply to the case study about the Indian Act? Yes?
The democratic rights.
So maybe some democratic rights, because it said that they couldn't have political action, right? It said Indigenous peoples, Canada's First Nations, could not take political action to lobby the government, to try to convince the government, to pressure the government to better voice or better implement the voice of the Indigenous peoples. Now in Canada today, we have lobby groups for Canada's Indigenous peoples. Yes?
What about the official languages?
Yeah, so to some extent, now Cree is not necessarily an official language of Canada, but there should be minority language rights, and there should be the ability to speak your language in terms of that freedom of expression. So the official languages of Canada section is really about Canada's bilingual nation. And, you know, you might be looking at that and saying, well, why isn't Cree one of the official languages of Canada? If we're really talking about the founding nations and the First Nations, should we be talking about the languages they spoke? But in that section, they're speaking about the French rights. But you're right in the sense that there's collective rights in this charter, and one of the collective groups that Canada is founded upon are First Nations. So let's move on to another example of a time in the past when things may have been misrepresented by the government. So, moving on, this is not the right one. I have way too many windows open here. So why not open another one, right? So, let's look at the next one. Canadian women and the right to vote. For more than 50 years, until 1918, the Canada Elections Act barred women from voting and from running as candidates in federal elections. Canadian women began to campaign for the right to vote in 1876. Emily Howard Stowe, Canada's first female doctor, founded a club to promote women's suffrage, women's right to vote. The idea was so radical for its time that she gave the group a cover name, the Toronto Women's Literary Club. Over the next 4 decades, the fight for women's suffrage gradually gained momentum worldwide. England's famous suffragettes held large, angry rallies for the cause and were often imprisoned for their views. So, I don't think we need to pause for that long on this one. I think it's pretty obvious. So what caused the event? What's the problem in society here? What's at issue? Poppy?
Equality rights?
Equality rights, right? Women aren't being treated as equal. And what are they seeking? What do they want? They want the right to vote and to run an election. And because it's voting and running an election, we're probably talking about what other type of right? Democratic rights. So there it is. That would be the sections of the charter that would be being violated. Equality and democratic rights. Another case in Canada's history is the internment. Now, we often talk about the internment of Japanese Canadians, but in World War I, we were at war with the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and within the Austrian-Hungarian Empire were many Ukrainians. So we were at war with Ukraine, and at the same time, we had Ukrainians living in Canada. So, at the beginning of World War I in 1914, more than 8,000 people, Ukrainian and German descent, were arrested and sent to camps because of their collective identity. Canada and its allies were at war with Germany and Austria-Hungary, and part of Ukraine fell within enemy territory. Canada's government made the arrests under the War Measures Act, which passed in 1914 at the outbreak of the war. In many cases, the government seized the homes and possessions of those arrested. Many were men, but their families often also went to camps because they had no other choice. The people in turn had to work as laborers. They built roads, for example. They did not receive any wages. After the war ended and the War Measures Act was no longer enforced, the government required many people to remain in the camps and continue to work as laborers without pay. In 2005, Canada's Parliament passed the Internment of Persons of Ukrainian Origins Recognition Act, which acknowledges this event in Canadian history. It calls for a better public understanding of the important role of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in the respect and promotion of the values it reflects and the rights and freedoms it guarantees. The suggestion here is that because of the Charter, this cannot happen again. It happened against the Ukrainians in World War I, the Japanese in World War II. Because of the Charter, we shouldn't be able to intern people again. What sections of the Charter would help? So let's say we're at war with the Irish. That's a very fictional future, but let's say Canada's at war with Ireland, and they come to get Mr. McBride, and they say, you're Irish, you're going to an internment camp. I would say, no, I have a section of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that protects me. What's the section? Yes?
Equality rights?
Equality rights would be a good section to come up with, right? Yep. Some of my legal rights, right? You know, has there been a trial? Why am I being contained, detained, restrained, obtained? I'm just trying to come up with tained words now. Why am I being secluded? What is the case against me, right? So that I should have a trial before you're seizing my property. So legal rights, equality rights, they are prejudging me based upon my culture. And therefore, they're acting in a limiting way that makes Canada not a just society, but a society of injustice. So unfortunately, the same thing happens to the Japanese Canadians in World War II. So the point here being, is that in the past, before the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms was passed, Canada was a place of injustice. And the hope is that through the Charter, we will be a place of justice, not injustice. Next up, we have a quote. I'm going to read through the quote. It's from an American author. I'm going to read through it, and we're going to get you to break it down. Did you know that vampires have no reflections in a mirror? There's this idea that monsters don't have reflections in a mirror. And what I've always thought isn't that monsters don't have reflections in a mirror. It's that if you want to make a human being into a monster, deny them, at the cultural level, any reflection of themselves. And growing up, I felt like a monster in some ways. I didn't see myself reflected at all. I was like, yo, is something wrong with me? That's the whole society seems to think that people like me don't exist. And part of what inspired me was this deep desire that before I died, I would make a couple of mirrors. That I would make some mirrors so that kids like me might see themselves reflected back and might not feel so monstrous for it. What is the author Diaz saying? What's the problem they see in society? What's the solution they want? That's what I want you to think about. What is the problem they see, and what's the solution they want to create? So, what problem do they see in society? Yes?
That not everyone's treated equal, and obviously this person in political obviously wasn't being treated as everyone else because of his race.
So not everyone's being treated equal. Some people are being marginalized, discredited because of their ethnicity, their culture, their race. And the solution that Diaz has is that people need to be able to see people, their culture. So ideally, you're in grade 9 now. Ideally, by the time you're grade 9, you would have had, as a teacher, someone from your culture teaching you. If not, that's an issue. And it's easy for me as a white European Canadian to look back on my first 9 years and say, yeah, I had lots of teachers that looked like me. In fact, all of my teachers looked like me. Except Miss Mendoza. She didn't. Because, she was Latino and she was a woman. But the rest of the males, they certainly looked like me. They might have been German, they might have been French, They might have been British, I didn't have any Irish teachers, but they looked like me, and I saw a mirror of me then. I saw a potential for me. And in America, Diaz is saying they didn't have mirrors. They didn't see politicians or police officers or captains of industry in their community that looked like them, right? Now, where are the people of your culture in positions of authority that are providing role models? If you don't see any, then what was Diaz's solution? Diaz had to become that mirror. Knowing what it's like to grow up without mirrors, then your life purpose becomes being a mirror for others. So rather than saying, oh man, I have no mirrors, be a mirror for the next generation. Because if everybody just always says, there's no mirrors for me, then there's going to be no growth for you either. Become a mirror for the next people is what Diaz is saying. Now that becomes your life goal, is to become a role model and say, look what I've done. Look what I've been able to do. So next up, we're going to look at a documentary from my home city of Billings, Montana. So we're going to go down to Montana. We're going to go to Billings. We're going to look at a documentary that's 5 minutes long called Not in Our Town. And I want you to, after the video, tell me about the purpose of the video. It'll just take me 1 minute to get it set up, and we'll take a look at it.